We have access on a daily basis to senior leaders and to, I guess, influential decision makers who can make changes in the hiring structure and what they're doing.
Over the last couple of years, we've made sure that as a business, our culture and the service that we offer is a representation of what we want to see in society. So we will be talking to these senior leaders about some of the challenges and getting into detail around some of the initiatives that have been successful and worked for them.
What we really would like to do is kind of normalise the conversation and get people comfortable with having conversations around diversity and inclusion.
All right, so today we've got the wonderful Frank Starling, who I've known for probably about 18 months to 2 years now. Time's absolutely flown with the pandemic and whatnot. But Frank is the founder and chief diversity officer at a company called Variety Pack. Frank's super passionate for all things DE&I, and I'll leave him to kind of give you a snapshot of his career to date and how he got into being a DE&I specialist.
Thanks so much, Magnus, and great to be here. And yeah, how time has flown over the last couple of years for obvious reasons. So as you mentioned, so I'm founder of Variety Pack, and our focus is really helping organizations to become more inclusive in a meaningful way, to champion the underrepresented, and to create cultures full of confidence. And that's a tricky thing to do. I think a lot has changed on a societal level where the expectations are particularly high. And for me, I genuinely want to see a step change both in the workplace and within our communities. And I got into this work having pivoted from property. I worked in property for about 10 or 11 years. And around 7 years ago, I started to volunteer with my local council in Hackney to tackle unemployment with young Black men. It was actually the highest in the country at the time. And it was really frustrating because, I come from a low socioeconomic background. I grew up on a council estate, with a single parent household. And I just saw how opportunities, weren't, I'd say, spread fairly enough, and it was really difficult for individuals to gain access. So I felt that I could make some of the biggest impact, beyond any mentorship and philanthropy outside of the workplace. I felt I could make the biggest impact actually in the workplace, where we can actually think about how can we create work cultures which work for everyone, essentially. So irrespective of who you are and your background, you've got an opportunity to be the best version of yourself. And that kind of led me through various different roles. I helped to develop something called the Brixton Finishing School, which basically gets underrepresented talent into the creative industry. I was the head of mentorship and then run operations on that for a while. I was VP of a company called Workin, which is a D&I tech company. And then round about 2.5 years ago, I founded Variety Pack, and now we've had some really great success, I think, delivering really meaningful work.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that snapshot, Frank. And that story is pretty inspirational itself, right? In terms of you kind of noticing a problem and potentially, in fact, going through things that you probably shouldn't have been going through, and then going out of your way to make sure that you can kind of impact and make some change. And that's why it's great to kind of have a discussion with you today, because I know we've spoken a few times, right? And I think people are always passionate about a piece of the diversity, equity and inclusion pie, whereas having conversations with yourself, you've got a deep understanding and knowledge of the whole thing, is what I would say, the whole pie. So I guess a good place to start, Frank, and I certainly want to touch on some of the things you just mentioned there in that snapshot later on in the discussion. But I think in keeping with Pride Month, a good place to start would be what are some of the kind of initiatives or some of the workshops that you potentially kind of put on for some of your clients around LGBT community and so on and so forth?
Yeah, well, the focus has really been, how do we celebrate individuals who are from the LGBTQ plus community? Because I think for far too long, we've seen laws in society, we've seen workplace cultures, we've seen just general rhetoric exclude this community, sometimes in a really damaging way. So, our focus has really been, how can we create these meaningful interactions? And we've got a number of consultants that work with Variety Pack, that part of my team, who identify as LGBTQ plus, who have delivered some really meaningful workshops, talking from their lived experiences, talking about how they've grown and owned their sense of belonging, and more so, I think, help to educate and advocate for other communities, because there's a huge spectrum. You know, people just roll off LGBTQ plus, and that's a huge spectrum of people. You know, there are so many different identities and lived experiences within that spectrum. So our focus has really been, you know, sharing some meaningful stories, not necessarily trying to change hearts and minds, but actually give people that awareness of, you know, these are some of the lived experiences, but that you may not necessarily be aware of. And these are some of the practical things that you can do to be an ally to the LGBTQ plus community. You know, it's the simple things. It's adding pronouns within our signatures. It's not assuming gender when you're having a conversation with someone. It's not making assumptions as to who people see on the weekend, or whether they have kids, or whether, you know, they're going out with their wife. You know, these are the classic, I think, things that we can say, these microaggressions that can really impact people's sense of belonging, can impact their sense of, you know, them owning their space. So our focus has really been, you know, sharing those lived experiences, but also providing some practical insights as to how can we show up for this community in the most meaningful way possible.
Yeah. And do you have any of those kind of practical insights that you could potentially share with us?
Well, I think it's looking at, you know, taking a real kind of analysis of your work culture, and firstly asking, you know, are we excluding or are we including people from different communities? And that this is obviously beyond LGBTQ plus. This is any group that's underrepresented. But we have to take an analysis in terms of the language that we put in job descriptions. You know, whether we have visible pronouns on our careers page. You know, whether we are actually, you know, we've got a bit on our website on the About Us that clearly states, you know, we are friendly to all communities. You know, diversity and inclusion means something for us. And this goes a very long way, because if I'm thinking to apply to an organization, I'm really kind of thinking about whether it's going to be safe for me as an individual. You know, am I going to get the job and then the first day in, I'm going to experience multiple microaggressions and people are going to question my sense of belonging? So I think, you know, setting your stall out as an organization, being clear that you're an ally to all these different communities out there, and taking a stance on diversity and inclusion. And that could be posting a charter or posting your diversity and inclusion policy actually on your main internet page. These things go a very long way, I think, to give people that sense of comfort and trust that if they do reach out, it's the right decision.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. And again, this is why I was so keen to talk to you, just for those kind of finer, deeper insights, if you like. And in terms of branding, sorry, I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, but obviously I'm quite biased in terms of I'm always thinking about kind of the talent attraction piece, given what I do. In terms of like the whole branding piece and making sure that external people are in a place where they understand that you are taking your diversity, equity, and inclusion piece seriously. What would you say that should look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, Magnus. I think in terms of, you know, branding and how we put ourselves out there to the world, I think we want to take a critical eye in terms of how the website may look. You know, just imagining yourself from someone's shoes. So imagine if I'm a Black woman with a visible faith group. Will I see myself identified on your website at all, even in the smallest way possible? You know, will I see text, you know, in certain pages on the careers page or on the main web page where actually the executive leaders or the SLT are making a comment about inclusion and diversity? You know, will I see any anecdotes or videos or testimonials or case studies from individuals who work for the organization talking about their sense of belonging and inclusion? Because 9 times out of 10, I'd say underrepresented candidates are fearful that they're going to experience a toxic work culture. And that's just that, and that's way beyond just general toxicity. You know, if someone just, you know, just doesn't know how to communicate, there's an extra layer on top of that, which is I'm marginalized, you know, I'm underrepresented within this work culture. Therefore, I'm fearful that I'm going to suffer from imposter syndrome. I'm fearful that I'll be able to engage with a homogeneous work culture. I'm fearful that I won't be able to speak my truths when, let's say, I read an article on a Friday morning, I'm triggered by that article, and I have no conduit in which to, share my perspective. So I think when it comes to branding, we want to take a real honest look at all of our different comms channels and consider whether, we have some sort of narrative on inclusion and diversity. And I think beyond that, it's actually being honest and transparent. Most organizations, they're on a journey. They haven't absolutely nailed inclusion. They don't have a real fruitful, diverse senior leadership team or executive leadership team. But knowing that you're doing something about it, that we're on a journey, we're asking the right questions, again, I think that makes a huge difference to instill that confidence in all these different communities out there.
Yeah. Great. And again, touching on what you've just said there around the kind of senior leadership piece and not necessarily having the diverse representation that they want, but they've certainly kind of identified that that's something they want to change moving forward. One thing I would say I've certainly identified from some of the conversations that I have is that there's almost, and I've said this to a few people I've spoken to, there's almost a nervousness around kind of actually addressing the overarching issue because they're not in the right place as things stand. And I think it's really important that people that are kind of championing the kind of diversity, equity and inclusion piece, people like yourself who go into businesses, have you found that there has to be a certain type of approach so that you can bring these leaders on a journey as opposed to make them feel inferior, or as opposed to kind of making them, I don't know, as opposed to magnifying the fact that, listen, you are in a bad place and this is what I can do to help you, type of thing? What approach would you say you've had to use to kind of get results?
Yeah, there's a few points there. I think firstly, when we lack representation at an executive level or a senior leadership level, it's an incredibly difficult task to get it right. Because firstly, we have to define representation. Do we define it as diversity in gender, in race, in sexual orientation, in religion? There are so many aspects of diversity.
Exactly.
So I think once we have a good idea and we've defined that, I believe in calling people in as opposed to calling them out. From my perspective, I can't expect someone who's had a very particular lived experience lived through a particular set of circumstances to understand my view, to understand my passion for change immediately. So I think meeting people where they are is critical. And it's really kind of tackling this idea of, how do we have an uncomfortable conversation? So how do we speak to the truths of where we are? And how do we set out some sort of plan and strategy? So taking a small wins approach, we can actually make progress. And I think when that doesn't happen, I think when people are called out and almost shamed for not being in the right place, I've seen it time and time again, it just creates a sense of inertia and often fear to engage with the topic. So, my personal opinion and our consultancy style is, we try to meet people where they are. We try to dismantle and flatten the language around inclusion and diversity because it can be very esoteric and hard to engage with. And then beyond that, we look at very practical and actionable ways that we can make a difference. Because the flip side is that if you're an underrepresented employee, if you're lower down the runway, it's very difficult to be what you can't see. And people expect that in terms of their sense of belonging. They expect to be represented. And I think the tide has shifted now over the last 2-3 years, where inclusion was kind of a nice to have. It was kind of maybe fourth or fifth to work satisfaction. It's now in the top 3. And now I think candidates are going in thinking, well, actually, if there isn't representation at a senior leadership level, at very least, I need to know there's some sort of strategy around inclusion and diversity.
Yeah, that's powerful. So calling people in as opposed to calling people out. I think that's so powerful, right? And listen, this may be a bit of a generic assumption, but most senior leaders will have a level of ego. So to be told that
we all do. Yeah, we all do.
Exactly. It never goes down too well, right? So I think that's super powerful. And sticking on the topic of obviously how this issue has been addressed even more so over the last couple of years for obvious reasons that have been well publicized. And obviously we can talk about the George Floyd situation, but in terms of you actually seeing a shift in organizations and where they want to go with this, what's that look like over the last kind of like 18 months to 2 years for you?
I think the most significant shift I've seen over the last 2 years is an appetite to really get stuck into the hard data. It's really difficult to know that, you know, your company lacks diversity, has challenges with inclusion, with microaggressions, you know, where certain demographics lack a sense of belonging. But I think over the last couple of years, many companies have been willing to, you know, look at those truths, come up with some sort of plan to create positive change. You know, are we there yet? Have we made enough progress? I wouldn't say we have. I would say we have a long way to go. There is a danger that we'll kick the can down the road and would expect change to just kind of emerge over the next few years. But fundamentally, you know, we've got to take the right interventions, and we've got to be honest with ourselves. You know, what sometimes frustrates me is even practitioners are kind of giving people a pat on the back to say, look, you've done a great job. And look, I think credit when it's due, in my personal opinion. You know, once we've got to a stage where I know you're underrepresented folks within your organization are proud, they feel like they can belong, you know, they feel like they're represented, they feel like the culture's working for them. That's when we can start to celebrate success. You know, when we start to see more underrepresented candidates apply for senior leadership roles, for executive level roles, you know, above middle management, again, that's when we start to celebrate success. But I think the danger at the moment is we take our eye off the ball. You know, as the conversations quieten, as we get outside of these months of celebration, when we're celebrating diversity, that's the point where we need to catch ourselves. You know, that's the point where we can become a little bit lax and forget that, you know, diversity and inclusion is something we should be pulling in to the business strategy. And within this new way of working, you know, we've all had to innovate and turn into kind of a, you know, a completely new way of engaging and working over the last couple of years. Inclusion is one of the best things that you can leverage. Without question. You know, we've seen the McKinsey data that talks about innovation. We've read Rebel Ideas that talks about diversity of thought. But beyond that, you know, going back to that point of expectation, you know, candidates are expecting a sense of inclusion. They're expecting a strategy around diversity. And that's how you're going to maximize engagement. That's how you're going to go beyond satisfaction, because people actually have the psychological safety to feel like they can not just bring themselves, but bring their best selves to work. And I think that's all we want across the board. So I think that's a really, you know, if we want a business case, there's the business case.
Yeah. And what are the kind of initial kind of like real low hanging fruits that businesses could do, if you like, in the initial stages? So obviously the bigger corporates, typically, and you'll be able to kind of advise as well. Typically, they'll go out and hire a big chief diversity officer and kind of look at it from the top down. But when you're looking at, I guess, smaller companies like the company I work for, which is probably about kind of like 60 to 80 full-time employees, what are some things that they can do straight away? Because there's more of a personal feel there, right? What things would you recommend where that's concerned?
Yeah, I think when you're first starting out, I think the most important thing is to get a good baseline as to where we are. So there can be a typical knee-jerk reaction, as you say, of, you know, we start to, you know, we get loads of workshops delivered and we look at many interventions. I think it's a really positive thing to hire someone directly into a diversity and inclusion role, because that really sets the tone of where we're trying to head to in the future. But I think the very first thing is a bit of a data grab, really. We want to go on a discovery tour. And that discovery tour encompasses a number of different things. So firstly, it's beyond an employee engagement survey. It's a very specific diversity and inclusion belonging survey, which will allow people to, again, share their perspectives of whether they feel a sense of belonging, and even some qualitative insights there as well, their experiences of just the work culture in general. So that's a really powerful piece. And then you want to analyze that to look at what are the core themes, what are our blind spots that have emerged from that bit of data. I think the second thing we want to do is go on a bit of a listening tour of the SLT, of the exec board members as well, because we want to really understand, again, what are our blind spots? How do we define unearned privilege? How are these leaders talking about inclusion and diversity? Because that also is very powerful data to identify where there might be some skills gaps. And I think the third thing we want to do is really pull all this together and think about some focus groups. So, you know, we've sent out the survey, we've spoken to the SLT, and now we probably want to build up some granularity and speak to our team members in smaller groups to really understand their sense of belonging, their sense of inclusion, their sense of purpose, and all these things together, I think, creates a really strong baseline that you can start to pull across. What are your maybe 3 or 4 metrics that we can create? What scorecard can we create to track our progress going forward? And then I think at that point, that's when you start to look at interventions, at training, at workshops, etc., to really build this authentic approach. It's not going to happen in 3 to 6 months. You know, it's going to take, you will see change 9 to 12 months down the line, but that's the point where it's got to be continuous. So.
Yeah, powerful stuff. And can you elaborate a bit more on just the whole kind of interventions piece?
So I think with interventions, it's really important to be precise. You know, what we do as a company is once we go through that discovery tour, we take all that data, we complete a thematic analysis, and that analysis will be on the basis of various different categories. So it may be bias in the organization, it may be belonging and allyship. And once we divide those categories up, we then provide very clear recommendations as to what we think interventions would be useful for this organization. So that could be anything from hosting workshops on particular topics, so things like inclusive leadership, anti-racism, allyship, to really build a sense of awareness. Or it could be even more detailed. So when we're looking at the systems and policies of an organization, it could be getting into the nitty-gritty. What does the handbook say when I need to report an incident of racism? What resources do we have internally to support me if I have caring responsibilities? You know, what do I do if I've got a challenge with my line manager because they don't quite understand my lived experience and they're making jokes and slights and snubs, which I feel are inappropriate? Because I think it starts with changing hearts and minds, and then we've got to look at a systems level change. And I think these two things combined, that's when we know we're making progress. So the interventions are you know, can be incredibly broad, but I think the key thing is that they've got to be meaningful, and they've got to be relevant to every organization. Every company is different.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. And one thing that I guess a lot of leaders that I speak to tend to not so much struggle with, but that it's certainly something they're all trying to kind of get to grips with, is that geographical split. So when you're talking about these big global corporates, what they do in one place may not work in another, right? Obviously, there's cultural differences and nuances that as I'm sure you know. Can you give some advice around that?
So I think when you have a globally dispersed workforce and trying to essentially come up with some sort of diversity and inclusion strategy, it has to be firstly based on your values. So I think you've got to tie in your values, because those essentially form the foundation of what are the core pillars that need to be replicated across every single territory. So for example, across every single territory, we're going to take a zero tolerance on jokes that are associated with race and gender, etc. You know, something like that is a commonality that can work in any single territory. We then need to take a bit more of a global approach though as well, because as we know, the conversation around diversity and inclusion and equity in the US versus the UK is incredibly different. In the UK, we talk more about class. You know, we have challenges obviously around talking about anti-racism, misogyny, sexism, etc. In the US, we have similar conversations, but that equity piece has been going for a very long time now. And there are certain multinationals that are far more advanced in terms of that equity conversation compared to the UK. In Japan, you know, talking about racial diversity is an afterthought at this point. You know, we're not even there in terms of gender diversity. So I think you've got to have this overarching strategy, but then you've got to look at what are the local interventions that are going to be relevant for this particular hub. And the best way to do that is to hear from our team members. We can co-create inclusion. You know, it doesn't need to be something which is just owned by the diversity lead, just owned by the people team. We can actually seek feedback and seek input to find out, how do our team members expect the organization to show up for them? You know, what practical things do they feel they need in order to feel empowered? And you'll be surprised just how passionate sometimes people are with, you know, offering that information and insights.
Yeah. So would you say, just, and this is just me kind of from some of the answers that you've given, and certainly some of the things that you guys do at Variety Pack, would you say kind of data, number one, and workshops are probably your kind of biggest tools in terms of at least kind of starting the journey?
Yeah, I'd say we have a variety of different tools that we need to pull upon. So I think the data piece is really important. What we advocate for, though, is that we don't try and use data to quantify humans' ability, because I think that's when we start to get into muddy waters, because we think, well, the data tells the complete and utter story, when in actual fact, it doesn't, but it is a really important piece. So I think getting that data is critical. I think coming up with some sort of scorecard, that's really, really important. You know, some clear metrics, some clear objectives and key results that we can use to track our progress going forward. And then the interventions are key. And the interventions have always got to be followed up with some sort of, you know, action points or a toolkit, just so we can start to come together as an organization, because there are usually massive skills gaps in terms of how we interpret this work. You know, I've delivered workshops where people have not understood what the word empathy means in a practical sense, what allyship means in a practical sense. So we almost want to flatten the language across the organization, and then in the future really see how we're making progress. So I think there's always a you know, a toolbox that we refer to. What we're really looking for is, with this particular client, how can we make meaningful change over an extended period of time? How much do leaders care about this change? Because they've got to be bought in to the process itself. And is something like, for example, psychological safety, is it present within the organization? Do people feel they can speak their truths without being shamed or judged? Because that in itself is a massive piece. You know, it's a massive intervention that we've got to look at just to tackle. So yeah, lots of different things that we focus on, if that answers your question.
Yeah. No, it does, for sure. Certainly does. Okay, brilliant. And in terms of, let's go back a step. And I said I would want to kind of get into the detail around this a bit more, and just talk about your kind of your upbringing and your background, which has enabled you to be to do some of the great stuff that you do today. It would certainly be good to hear a bit more about that kind of initial journey. Obviously, you stepped away from the estate agency side of things. It's probably, it feels like a long time ago now. But yeah, if you can give us a bit more detail and insights into that, that would be great.
Yeah, well, my journey was an interesting one. Growing up in East London, growing up in Hackney, I think seeing, one and only East London. Yeah, oh my goodness, yeah. People speak so highly of it now. It was such a different place. In the 80s and 90s. But I think for me, I was always inspired by my mother's resilience. I'm mixed race. I identify as black, but I'm Nigerian and Sri Lankan. My mother's Sri Lankan, and I just grew up with her. I never met my father. And just seeing her resilience of trying to bring up 2 kids on her own. When my father left my mother, we were literally homeless. My mum was living in the back of a storeroom in a cafe. She was working in that cafe for £1 an hour. My sister was 7, 8 years old, and I was a baby. I was 6 months old. We were there for several months. And every time I kind of think about that story, obviously I was too young to be cognizant of it. I'm just so grateful that I'm here today, because that's kind of how my journey started. And I think for me, it was seeing my mother just get through challenge after challenge and experience actually a lot of misogyny, sexism, racism. She had
Yeah.
some really terrible incidents in the workplace.
Yeah.
So I didn't know, I think growing up, I didn't know that was something I was passionate about, but I just knew that, you know, creating some sort of fairness and equality was something that was really important to me, you know, and it started off on a community level. You know, as I got past secondary school, I kind of went into full-time work quite early at 17. You know, I've been working all the way through, and I always knew that, you know, personal development was something that I was passionate about. You know, I used that as my tool, because I thought, if I'm from this background, unless I read books, you know, unless I go through different education programs, you know, how am I ever going to compete at the highest level? And that, I would say, gave me the best possible opportunity to succeed in life. So I was really passionate about speaking my truth, sharing my blueprint, I think, with people from my community, and did a lot of mentorship over the years. And then as time passes, I got into property, got into quite senior positions at property. I realized that as much as I love the role, as much as I love the industry, there's more that I should be doing. There's more that, you know, I need to do to live through my truths and live through my passion. And that kind of drove me into this world of entrepreneurship and diversity and inclusion. And today I can say, you know, I'm really pleased. I'm really grateful. I see it as a privilege, funny enough, to do this work, because, you know, I don't need to be on the front line, you know, advocating for, you know, I'd say survival in many respects. If you think about where this work has come from, you know, affirmative action, we're in Pride Month, so the Stonewall riots, you know, all these noble human beings that, you know, many of them sacrificed their life just to get, you know, just to get us to where we are today, where we're promoting values of inclusion and diversity. So for me, I almost feel like I'm indebted to do something about this. And yes, it's a commercial venture for me. You know, I own a business, but at the same time, I genuinely care about the deliverables. I genuinely care about the change that we can make, again, both in work cultures and on a societal level. So I think those are the kind of main things that have inspired me. And I think it's just meeting just amazing people who also care passionately about doing something about inclusion and diversity. You know, I think that always drives me to just get better, improve what we do, improve how we can serve our clients, and create meaningful change.
Yeah. Brilliant. That's super powerful. And in terms of visibility, so going back to when you were growing up in the beautiful sunny East London, visibility. So I grew up in South London, pretty similar upbringing. We've had this discussion. I won't get into it now, but visibility for me was always an issue. I obviously went down the professional football route, which was clearly visible because I saw it on the TV. Not necessarily actually had people in and around me who were playing football, but I could see it every day. I knew it was something I loved, and I was fortunate enough to do it for 17, 18 years. But I think there is more visibility now, just because there's a lot more social media and there's a lot more platforms where you do have access to different cultures and different professions and so on and so forth. But how important would you say it is? And I think I kind of know the answer, but I guess I'm looking for some practical steps here that could be taken to increase visibility in some of the areas and socioeconomic backgrounds that we kind of have discussed throughout this conversation.
Yeah, I think visibility and visible representation is absolutely key. I mean, growing up for me, I could only see Trevor McDonald, Lenny Henry, Will Smith. I mean, we're talking about a handful of individuals that maybe I could identify with. In the workplace, it was almost impossible to see individuals like me. You know, they were few and far between. I think as of today, if we take London as a capital city, over 40% of London is Black and Brown, or BAME, as some people use. So what that tells us is the representation is there. You know, we need to dig deeper. We need to work harder to ensure that, you know, we are hiring candidates from all sorts of different backgrounds. And it's an essential part, I think, you know, going back to that word belonging. Because if I'm to feel a sense of belonging, if I'm to feel like there aren't glass ceilings and sticky floors within this organization, I need to see representation. And I think we're still lagging behind. I think things have changed over the last few years, where maybe within media publications, within, you know, if you see, if you go to the supermarket and you see some copy and images, I mean, representation and you know, that idea of, I think, just being present in lots of different spaces, it's not easily done. You know, it requires an entire overhaul. But I do think, you know, representation is a really important thing, and we've got to think about it in a meaningful way. We've got to say to ourselves, is this inclusive of every community, or as many communities as we can speak to? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, Frank, listen, it's some great insight there, and I'm sure whoever kind of listens to this, it will certainly add value in terms of some of the things that they're looking at doing moving forward. So listen, really grateful and appreciate you kind of taking the time out of what I know is an extremely busy schedule to give us some of that insight. But before I let you go, just in keeping with our theme, obviously this is called the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Bucket List. It would be wrong of me to let you go without asking you what's on your own kind of personal bucket list, certainly after the year and a half we've just had. Yeah, on my personal bucket list is definitely a skydive. Okay. Right now, living on the edge. You know, I think for many, I think I'm still at the point where I'm very fearful of doing one. So I'm building up confidence at some point. You know, I'll do that skydive. So now at 6'8", I'm a bit worried that the instructor's going to be able to carry my weight. So. Yeah, exactly. My wife always says similar things when I say, "Oh, what do you fancy doing this year?" So I want to bungee jump. I'm like, listen, we've got kids now. We can't. Yeah, exactly. It can't be that ambitious. I probably need to tail that in. Also got a new son, you know, 4 months old. So I might need to curb that for maybe I can live vicariously through him in the future. So exactly. But listen, Frank, thanks again. I'm sure the viewers will take some huge value from some of your insight. Really appreciated. No worries at all. Thanks, Magnus. Thanks for your time. Take care. Bye-bye. Cheers.